Hello, everybody, and welcome to another article review. Today we have George Edelman. Thanks for coming and hanging out with us today, George.
Happy to be here.
George, I've known you for a month or two now, and one of the first things Chris, who I actually talked with in our last article review, told me was that you work with the Olympic swim team. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your other history as a physical therapist?
Sure. Let's see. So I've been practicing since 1996 and went to the University of St. Augustine's, Stanley Paris's program in Florida. I swam in college, and turns out my wife, Julia Gorman, who I met in PT school, was also a national team swimmer. And so, our interests in treating the swimming athlete started back in 1996. I remember a class lecture on Vladimir Yanda and his reciprocal inhibition and that crossed shoulder syndrome that we were talking about. Tightness of the SCM can inhibit firing of the lower trapezius. And that was kind of the launching pad to reviewing swimming research, reviewing articles on the swimming athlete. And that's kind of when things started.
How long have you been working with the Olympic swimmers?
So Julie and I first started in 2000 as part of a ad hoc committee to review some injury prevention programs. And we met at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And that was, for me, my first interaction working with some of the doctors, the team physicians, and we developed an injury prevention program for shoulder injuries. And then about 2005, 2007, our roles changed a little bit. They started bringing us on at higher level meets, and not necessarily to treat the athletes. We were actually doing lactic acid testing at the time.
Oh.
And the USA Swimming was collecting a huge database of lactic acid, and we were testing it pre-swim, post-swim, and then 10 minutes after they've warmed down, just to see how quickly the athletes cleared the lactic acid. And then we would share that information with the coaches that then looked at the athletes' nutrition, looked at where they were in their training, were they fatigued, were they in a taper, and all of that. And then they matched that with their time in the event to see if they really put in 100% effort. And then I would say after 2007, then they started to really employ physical therapists, athletic trainers, massage therapists, chiropractors at the bigger meets, just to provide hands-on musculoskeletal care.
That kind of segues into the article we're reviewing that you wrote. It's more of like a training application, how to properly warm up or cool down. And that article is titled "A Dynamic Shoulder Warm-Up for the Competitive Swimmer." And you mentioned you wrote this about 10 years ago, but you revisited it about 5 years ago just to update any of the science that's behind what you referenced in there.
Right.
And it sounds like you're coming back to it again now and again updating it for a third edition.
Right.
So in that article, you talk about some of the standard stretches pre-warm-up or pre-competition, including a lot of the back slapping and stretching the arms out wide, getting the pecs loosened up, kind of probably increasing the laxity in the glenohumeral joint a little bit, and why that's not good. What kind of research did you find that tells us why that's not good?
Well, actually, let me step back a second. And so looking back at 2007, I was at one of the bigger Toyota Grand Prix events. I was in Columbia, Missouri, working with some of the national team athletes. And I'd had one of those aha moments where I was looking around, and I would say that 90 to 95% of all the swimming athletes on deck were doing the standard stretches that have been handed down from generation to generation, the standard stretches within the swimming community.
And we're talking about the cross body, the overhead, the
You got it, Brian.
flapping.
Yep. And then even some of the partner stretching,
Yep.
you know, where you just really don't have much control of your base based on what the partner's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And at this meet, I had a couple of the national team swimmers, and they were both, where there were three of them, they were all presenting with multi-directional instability. And they were having some secondary impingement. And then I was looking around, I was like, well, why are these swimmers who may be, you know, at risk for being lax to begin with, why are they stretching their glenohumeral joint capsules beyond their normal means? And again, this is something that's been done. And if you go to a swim meet now and look around on deck, those same stretches are still being employed.
It seems more of like a traditional component to the pre-competition.
Yeah, and again, they'll do that before practice. And so it's been a grassroots effort, and we're making headway. So with that, that springboarded me right into looking at the research, and then looking at static stretching versus dynamic warm-ups. And at the time, this was again 2009, and again 2015, and even to this day, if you look at the research, you'll find that while it's not unanimous, it definitely favors a dynamic warm-up for athletes. And it's favorable because they look at performance, and they found that static stretching may negatively impact muscle function versus the dynamic warm-up. Those athletes tended to perform better.
And if you click the link in the article below, that'll take you, or if you click the link in the description below, that'll take you to the article that we're referring to. And some of the updated warm-ups that you recommend, what we call like a no money, but it's really just warming up your external rotators, your rotator cuff.
Yeah.
There's also putting your hands on your hips and pinching your shoulder blades back. And then we have a horizontal abduction, and you recommend a complete 2 sets of 15 for those. Now, is this something that you would recommend using some type of resistance, like a resistance band, a TheraBand with, or just getting into those positions, holding them for a second, activating the muscles, and then moving on?
Yeah, no resistance is required. This is really just to warm up the shoulders before this athletes jump in the pool for workout or prior to competition. And or what's really important to note is that even here, well, throughout the country, there's no guarantee there's a warm-up pool at the venue. In other words, there may only be one pool available, and the swimming athlete may be at the meet for 8 to 10 hours. In other words, they may have a race at 9 o'clock, and then they may have 2 hours downtime until they race again. And so employing the dynamic warm-up in between events is really critical too.
You also mentioned some different stretches in here, but not necessarily to be performed right before or right after training or competition. Some of those stretches are a pec stretch. The main muscles that you refer to stretch are pec major, pec minor, the levator scapulae, and the upper trap, I believe.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about why those are so important to focus on in terms of keeping the balance in your cervical and shoulder muscles proper?
You bet. So in the course of a season, a swimming season, or in the course of a week, a month, the entire year, it's not unusual for the internal rotators to become proportionally stronger than the external rotators. And with just the nature of the stroke, the pectoralis, the subscap, the latissimus dorsi, those muscles tend to shorten in the course of the season. As well as, depending on the stroke mechanics, their breathing technique, sometimes the upper trapezius and the levator scapula muscles, again, just tend to get tight in the course of a season. while reviewing the literature, it did make sense that there is a place for static stretching. There is a place for static stretching in the swimming athlete. It's just at a time unrelated to workout, competition, and after workout. And so often we'd encourage the swimmer to employ those stretches either at night or in the morning, again, unrelated to practice.
I think in the article you mentioned several hours after a training session or competition to do those stretches.
Yeah, right. And so, intuitively, it makes sense to all of us, I think, that muscles just don't like to be stretched when they're fatigued.
Absolutely.
And so after a 2-hour workout, we don't encourage the swimmer to just get out, hop on the deck and stretch. We want them to go eat, hydrate, recover, and then consider stretching later in the day.
And that's specifically for a performance athlete, especially in swimming, as you're noting there. Now, so you've revisited this article. This will be your second time now in about 5 years, in about 10 years since it was originally started. What have you found in the past 5 years that's kind of changed? What addendums will you make to this article, if any?
It's funny. I think the research is still consistent. And so the recommendations still stand 10 years later. While it's not unanimous, the research still favors a dynamic warm-up prior to workout, prior to competition.
Yeah.
And still favors the fact that static stretching still has its place, and it just has to be applied appropriately.
Absolutely. I think that's, like you mentioned, pretty standard for practices now. So I think it's great that you're rewriting these articles about, or making any slight changes to them about every 5 years, because 5 years is kind of the cutoff when we look at research at what we can take with more than just a grain of salt. They really should be revisited at least every 5 years. So I applaud you for that. And do you have anything else you wanted to add on this article?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, the message is to try to get this out. Those stretches, again, in the article, there's like 5 typical stretches that swimmers tend to employ that can be problematic. What I think is, funny, again, is that these stretches are handed down from generation to generation. I think about my daughter when she was in first grade. In gym class, her gym teacher taught those stretches to her. And here's a gal that was already lanky and loose, and she definitely was not tight as a 6-year-old first grader. Mm-hmm. And from grassroots down, she's already being handed down these stretches without much rationale.
It's tough in a gym class setting where you have 30 kids in front of you and you're just trying to apply a one-size-fits-all program.
Right.
But I think that in a case like that, there should be some notice taken on changing up things a little bit, especially for kids or athletes that are on one extreme or the other.
The other point I'd like to add is, when we introduced this article back in 2009, it instantly went on the USA Swimming's website. It also went on the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons website, and it took ground. And what's been fun is now when I go to a swim meet and I go to those higher level national meets, Olympic trials, I'll see those dynamic warm-ups being applied, plus then variation. So it's been fun to see clinicians across the country coming up with just an assortment of very creative dynamic warm-ups for the swimming athlete.
Kind of creating their own bag of tricks there based off of what you've presented to everybody.
Yeah.
Slight alterations based on what their athlete needs, kind of like we were talking about just then, tweaking it a little bit just for their performance.
Right.
One exciting thing you've mentioned off camera was that the Olympics is going to start pursuing more education in open water swims. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Does that change how athletes are training, and obviously they're going to be swimming in more open waters, but um, from a physical therapy or a training point of view, does that change anything?
Right. So open water swimming has become very popular lately in swimming and among triathletes. And in 2012 was the first Olympic event for open water swimming. It was the 10K. And so my wife and I are about to get on a conference call with USA Swimming in a couple minutes. They're creating a portal just for open water swimming, and they're creating um, articles of interest and recommendations for the open water swimmer. And one of the things that they did is they reached out to us to talk about stretching and dynamic warm-ups. And one of the things we're seeing with the open water swimmer is a lot more neck and upper back issues. And that's coming from the sighting, because right, that's it, Brian. They've got to lift their head often in the course of a race just to sight the buoys. And
Because in a normal pool swim meet, you usually have that line at the bottom of the floor you can keep track on, but like you mentioned, you have to look up, see the buoys out of water.
yeah. And so, and also to see where their competitors are and try to maneuver throughout the pack. And so these guys are developing some tight upper trapezius, levator scap, the paraspinals. They're getting some restrictions in the mid-thoracic, upper thoracic spine. And interestingly, and maybe Brian, you could help me, but we're also seeing some tight hip flexors from open water swimming. And I haven't figured that one out yet. I'm still trying to see what's happening with the hips. Again, it may still be related to the sighting because the kick changes. I think when you lift your head to look around, you have to going to change your body position in the water and kick a little differently to keep the head up.
I would think that that could have something to do with it. Just that little change in posture in the water to look around. I that's a little surprising to me, but something that we can certainly look into.
Yeah. So we're going to talk to them in about a half hour and take this article and the dynamic warm-up that's already been introduced, and we'll probably modify it a little bit, try to get some dynamic cervical and thoracic warm-ups, plus some address the hip flexors.
Sounds good to me. Well, if you need any assistance, let me know and I'll do the best I can, but I know that's really your forte, so I think you'll do fine without me.
Well, if you can think about why those hip flexors are getting tight,
Yep.
we're still trying to dial that in.
Sounds good to me. I will look into it. George, thank you very much for hopping on this article review with me. And again, the link is below to that article in the description. Any final comments?
Oh, Brian, I'm thrilled that you were able to bring me aboard. I enjoy being part of your process.
Love having you on, George. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Thank you.